Welcome to everybody who is joining us now for this webinar. It's the human cost of glyphosate. And this is January 26th, 2021 via Zoom. Welcome to COVID and webinars. And if you have not attended a webinar in the COVID time, you are just not living because it's very exciting. Okay, here we are, 7 o'clock. And so this is the beginning of the webinar, The Human Cost of Glyphosate. I'm Catherine Harrop. I'm going to be your moderator this evening. And we are going to be hearing from Stephanie Seneff, Meg Sears, Rod Cumberland, and you will have a chance to ask your questions and answers. So I want to say, first, we'd like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Wolastoq and Mi'kmaq nations in the east. And our presenters hail from points west and south. Thank you for joining us. We understand that there are attendees from Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Hawaii. Now, housekeeping note first, hope you found the parking okay. And you know what? I don't need to tell you where the bathroom is, do I? It's probably down the hallway. Okay. A notice that this session is being recorded. So again, I will repeat that halfway through the broadcast. This session is being recorded. So you will hear from two presenters, Dr. Meg Sears and Dr. Stephanie Seneff. They will talk about their research into glyphosate and take questions. This is a session to give some of the latest research on the herbicide, allow you to ask questions, and to support the legal fund of Rod Cumberland. Now, Rod Cumberland, who's up on your screen there, is a well-known wildlife biologist and instructor. He was fired in 2019 from his position at the Maritime College of Forest Technology in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Now, Rod is suing the college, alleging he was fired for speaking out about the negative impacts of the chemical herbicide glyphosate. He is challenging that firing in court, and that is expensive. So this webinar is offered by the support team for Rod Cumberland. And if you would like to donate to that fund, I think we have, Rodrigo, do you have that address? It's a pretty straightforward address. You can find out more information, or you can e-transfer to friendsofrodcumberland@gmail.com. We'll put that address up later so you can copy that down. But it's all one word, friendsofrodcumberland@gmail.com. And Rod will speak briefly. You can say hi, Rod. He'll speak briefly at the end of the evening. Again, a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thanks, Rod. So now glyphosate, as you know, is used to knock back that leafy vegetation from power lines in New Brunswick, to clear the military training area of Base Gagetown, and in areas that are replanted after clear cutting. The spraying causes more controversy every year, and in New Brunswick, there were protests both in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia last year. Protesters looking at blocking helicopters that spray the glyphosate and the tanker trucks carrying it. This year marks the 20th anniversary of Quebec having decided to ban the use of glyphosates on forestry operations on public land. And Rod will address that later in the night. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our two presenters. Our first speaker is Dr. Meg Sears. She's an Ottawa scientist, holds a doctorate in biochemical engineering, is a research associate at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and is chair of Prevent Cancer Now, an organization that provides education, advocacy, and cancer prevention research to the public and the government. Dr. Sears' work on environmental sensitivities led to a policy adopted by the Human Rights Commission under the Canadian Human Rights Act as well as peer-reviewed publications with Prevent Cancer. Now, Dr. Sears has co-authored dozens of governmental submissions, including those on glyphosate. So Dr. Sears joins us from Dunrobin, a community in Ottawa, right? Dr. Sears, take it away. And you have to unmute yourself though, because we don't want to do it by mime. We don't have you, we have you. Can you unmute yourself?
I think that we're
There we
having
go.
an unmuting kind of going back and forth here, but
This is great. Thank you. And I'm just going to get our presenters to kill their video to give you a little more bandwidth, because we understand that's a little tricky.
Okay, could you please enable participant screen sharing? I'm told that the host is disabled screen sharing.
Okay, Rodrigo, you can handle that. Okay, try it now, Meg.
It's still disabled. How are we doing there? It's still disabled.
Well, tell us a little bit about your
yes, well, Prevent Cancer Now, we work to stop cancer actually before it starts. About 2 or 3% of all the funding that goes towards cancer actually looks at causes of cancer and tries to stop it, preemptively. And so one of the important topics that we look at is pesticides. And we have looked at how the science is done, how we can tease out effects of one versus another exposure in the complex world that we live in, because pesticides aren't the only thing we're exposed to. And we're making some pretty good progress in that way, both improving the way science is done and improving some exposures in Canada. But it's not a quick road. Rodriguez, we've still disabled participant screen sharing here.
I don't think it was me, because
I don't know how
you should be able to share like we did yesterday.
Well, if you have my slides, perhaps you could put them up.
Yeah, no problem.
Because we still, it's still telling me I can't share my screen.
Weird.
Rodrigo, if you look at the screen share icon, there should be a little caret next to it for you. And if you click on that, you'll get an option.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Done.
Welcome to technology, folks. Thank you for bearing with us.
Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, we will do it this way. And we'll hope that this works properly, because there's always logos in the way once you start sharing your screen. So is that showing up properly?
Not yet, but we did have this issue a little while when there
was, yes,
yeah,
the
it takes
electrons
a
are
while,
very
so
slow.
yeah, we're just going to be patient. Wait till the screen starts to share.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience in the audience.
Yes, thank you very much.
You could answer a question while we're waiting to see it pop up.
Have we got a question? I'd love.
Yes. Why has our government not created laws preventing the use of glyphosate, even after all the input they have received for decades from all sorts of credible sources?
Good question. Glyphosate is the most used, it was the largest volume of all pesticides in Canada, and I think it would probably be rather disruptive. That would be the political angle on it. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but there is a lot of generation of doubt. There has been a lot of generation of doubt throughout, years and years and years. How long did it take to get rid of lead from paint? lead causes huge problems in children's development. And at the end of last century, the Lead Council of America said that their greatest accomplishment was delaying by 60 years the vanishing of lead from house paint. So we are seeing continuous generation of doubt and pushback from industry and delay. And this generation of doubt results in continuing exposures, which is most unfortunate.
Well, we still don't see your screen, Meg Sears. Not quite sure what to say.
It's,
Perhaps,
let's see.
there we go.
There you go.
Ah, okay.
Good.
And are you seeing the actual slide?
We are.
Wow, that was a lucky guess. Well, thank you ever so much for the organizers, for Rod, for all that he's done, for everybody's amazing patience with technology and the problems with broadcasting from Dunrobin, which has one of the worst internet services in Ontario, evidently, according to the Government of Canada. We will talk today about glyphosate. Now, this is being shared and it won't advance. This is ridiculous. Here we go. So glyphosate, I was originally trained as a chemist. And when I first saw this chemical, I thought, gee whiz, that is just a tiny little chemical. It looks so safe. It has none of the horrible chlorines and so on that were making so much trouble with all of the herbicides that went before. What could possibly go wrong? And a lot of people thought the same thing. So from 2007 on, which is the extent of our data, glyphosate has been the most used herbicide, actually the most used pesticide in Canada. The Pest Management Regulatory Agency within Health Canada has a special category for it. It's more than 25 million kilograms a year that's sprayed on our lands. Now, there's another special category, which is more than 5 million, and that is for chlorine bleach. So we use 5 times more glyphosate than chlorine bleach, which gives you some kind of idea of how much we use. And this is a slide, some information from a recently published paper from Christy Morrissey's group out west. And it just shows how much herbicide use has increased over the years in Canada. And since glyphosate is by far and away the most used herbicide, basically we're looking at how much glyphosate use has increased. There are some concerns for food, because most glyphosate across the country is used on food, that it is actually increasing the mycotoxins, that's toxins from molds, and cadmium. And there's actually a Keeping It Clean website. If you hear clicking, it's my dog walking around, I apologize, for the producers, because it's very important. We've had food turned around in Europe because it's had too much contamination that is actually quite strongly linked to glyphosate. Now in New Brunswick, we have most of the, well, a majority of the glyphosate is actually used for forestry. 51% is aerially sprayed and 10% is used on the ground. Now, this is a photograph from Northern Ontario, although I expect that similar photographs could be taken in New Brunswick. It was taken by Joel Theriault, who's a lawyer and a pilot, who I expect you will hear from in the coming weeks. It's apparently difficult for forest sprayers to respect buffer zones to keep the herbicides away from water, which is actually pretty important for the water supplies. Here you see that glyphosate has eliminated the ground cover, the flowering plants for pollinators, berries, and fast-growing species such as poplar and birch for larger animals. And it's also eliminated things that we can't see, all of the microbes, well, not all of them, but many microbes that are essential for healthy soil, and microbes that are important for us as well. So the microbiome is central to our health at environmental concentrations of Roundup. There is, they've measured in the lab that there is reduction and impacts on the types of microbes in rats, and it also can affect the development of puberty. Now, in Canadian children, we find that if the microbiome is not in proper distribution of microbes, then we get inflammatory bowel disease. And inflammatory bowel disease has been going up at 7% every year in Canadian children under age 6. So this is a life-altering problem for these children. And we also know that inflammatory bowel disease is linked to later development of colorectal cancer, and not by coincidence. That is increasing at 6.7%, which is very close to 7% in 15 to 29-year-olds in Canada. And in that study, it was, the authors noted that that was despite improvements over time in both their diet and habits and exercise. And when we went to, well, when somebody who we were collaborating with went to look at the confidential industry studies that were submitted to the PMRA, they did note that there was anal staining, which would be indicative of the sort of diarrhea that you get with this inflammatory bowel disease, but Health Canada did not consider that to be adverse, and so that lower dose was not factored into the approval of glyphosate. Glyphosate has also been linked to spontaneous abortion and early birth and infertility. And in fact, the earliest study of this was done by Health Canada. It was led by Ty Arbuckle, who has actually just retired from Health Canada. She's done some remarkable work. There was a subsequent study looking at an Indiana birth cohort that found that women with higher levels of glyphosate were likely to have shorter periods of gestation. And so that can lead to premature birth. And in animal studies, we found that glyphosate leads to problems with implantation. So can glyphosate cause cancer? I lead Prevent Cancer Now. We're very obviously interested in cancer. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is associated with the World Health Organization and is very independent, they're very meticulous about being independent from industry. They said in 2015 that glyphosate is probably a human carcinogen. And that caused Health Canada and health regulators around the world to come out with statements saying, well, IARC doesn't look at the science the way we do, and we think it's probably not a carcinogen. And the reason that they gave for IARC being irrelevant was that IARC does not consider exposures, because the regulators, they say, well, we've got this effect at this kind of exposure, and so it's not going to be applicable to people. But IARC actually considered Canadian real-life epidemiology, Canadian research factored into that determination by IARC. And they found that there was a dose-response relationship for glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So these lymphomas and blood cancers, they've actually been going up in Manitoba children. They've increased 1.4% between 1984 and 2013. We don't have information about children in other places. Manitoba has very good health records going back a long time, and that's the only way, that's the only reason that we have this research, actually. If you look at Canadian cancer incidence, the types of cancers that are going down are the ones that are associated with tobacco, and the ones that are going up are include ones that are associated with glyphosate exposure. They include the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and the leukemias and the multiple myeloma. So there is some doubt that has been developed in the research between the regulators around the world and the World Health Organization, and there's certainly there's certainly problems with the generation of doubt through industry work, but there was no doubt when the research was put before courts in California. So here we have two legal stars, Brent Wisner and Michael Baum, who led the 3 big Roundup lawsuits. And after winning those and having millions and millions of dollars in awards, Bayer, who has purchased Monsanto, ultimately agreed to pay it's $10 billion, almost $11 billion to settle the rest of them, because there are 100,000 of these lawsuits. And another interesting thing that has come out of the States was from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And they produce scientific assessments, but they are not a regulatory agency. So they came out with a big study just a couple of years ago, during the Trump years. And interestingly enough, they did not say in black and white, in words, that glyphosate causes cancer. But what they did was to look at the, if only I could move this, there we go. If you look at these diagrams, they're called forest plots. Down the left-hand side, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of studies, and the spots represent the likelihood that glyphosate caused cancer. And in the middle, there's a fine line, which is 1. So it causes we don't know. It's kind of even odds. But the really important thing is down at the bottom, where there are the meta-analyses, where the statisticians take all of the data that they have, and all of the meta-analyses are to the right of 1, which means that it's statistically significant that glyphosate caused non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that it's statistically significant, looking at all of the human data, that it caused multiple myeloma. So in the end, we have a forest that's not being sprayed. This one actually is from BC. So we know that forests have microbiomes, they have biodiversity, and they are hurt by glyphosate too. So biodiversity is like legs on a stool. And once you cut off too many legs, the system is no longer stable. So this photo is from CBC's story about deciduous trees that act as a fire break. There are so many implications that we don't even think about to start with. So as Lorik said, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So thank you, Rod, for caring and working hard to make things better. and for all of his friends, and for all of you attending, and for the honor to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Sears. Very informative.
Yeah.
You can put your questions in the Q&A box. We will come to them at the end of our next speaker. But first we're going to launch a quick poll just to see how awake you are out there, the attendees. Rodrigo, if you can launch that poll. Okay. How concerned are you about the spraying taking place in New Brunswick or your own province? With 1 being not concerned at all and 5 being very concerned. So we'll give our 59 attendees a chance to answer that, and then we'll share the results. And I'll ask Stephanie Seneff to turn her camera on and her mic, because she's up next. Okay. All right, what do we have, Rodrigo? Very concerned, 74%. 19% say they are less concerned, but still high up, and 4% not concerned at all. And 3% and 4% again, a little kind of middle of the plot there. Okay, thank you for sharing your views. Now we have Stephanie Seneff ready to go. She is our second speaker. She is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a Bachelor of Science in Biophysics, a PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science from MIT. She has authored over 36 peer-reviewed journal papers and is writing a book on glyphosate entitled, here's the promo, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. And that will be released in June by Chelsea Green Publishers. Dr. Seneff is the only truly warm person in this entire webinar because she comes to us from Hawaii. So Dr. Seneff, please take it away.
Thank you very much. So let me pull up my screen and see if it works out okay. Put this up here. Okay, great. So the title of my talk is Glyphosate, Far More Toxic Than We Have Been Led to Believe. I always like to start off my slides with a quote, and my quote for today is, "The earth is not dying, it is being killed, and those who are killing it have names and addresses." And this was from the late activist musician, Utah Phillips. So first question, is glyphosate non-toxic? You know, we think glyphosate's a wonderful herbicide because it kills all plants except those that have been engineered to resist it. And it's practically non-toxic to humans. That's the line we've been hearing. And increasingly, recently, people are becoming very aware that that is not the truth. I think that more and more people are finding in recent studies that glyphosate is far more toxic than we'd been told. And the word is really starting to get out to the general population, which is great. So it's the most used herbicide on the planet. The US actually uses more per capita than any other country in the world. And I'm, of course, a United States citizen, so I care about that. Monsanto's argued that it's harmless to humans because our cells don't have this particular biological pathway that it disrupts, which is pretty much universal in plants. Humans don't have the pathway, and therefore they can't possibly be harmed by glyphosate. So it's a very easy message to believe, and it's something you want to believe because it's so convenient for controlling the weeds. But what they overlook is that our gut bacteria do have this pathway, and they use it to produce a lot of essential molecules that our own cells can't make because they don't have that pathway, especially the essential amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine, which are part of the coding of the DNA code. Those are the amino acids that go into the building of proteins that are the workhorses of the body. These microbes get harmed by glyphosate because of that pathway getting disrupted. And then they have many other things that they do for the host that can't, they become impaired because the microbes are being killed. So you get a disrupted gut microbiome, inflammatory gut, and all the problems that we're seeing with gut dysbiosis today. The other thing interesting is that Roundup is far more toxic than glyphosate by itself, especially acutely toxic. And this has been found in studies. They only tested glyphosate in isolation when they did the experiments that got its approval. But then they mix it up with various other things that make the glyphosate more toxic because it makes it easier for it to be taken up by the cells. And also other things that are actually intrinsically toxic in and of themselves. So Roundup has never been studied by Monsanto, but it is actually what's used on the crops. Now, the other problem is that glyphosate has an insidious cumulative effect over time. It doesn't all disappear. When you get exposed to glyphosate, some of it stays in your tissues. And that's been shown again from studies, even from Monsanto's early studies back in the 1980s. They've done a clever job of only looking over a short period of time, like up to 3 months. If you don't see any problems after 3 months, you're good to go. But studies have shown that the problems start to appear after 3 months, and they can become very serious over the course of the lifetime of an exposed rat. And so recently, as was said by Meg, there were 3 big lawsuits that were all 3 successful with large awards claiming that glyphosate caused non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And that has caused thousands of new lawsuits to come forward with this class action suit now underway. So this was an article by Menage et al. Published in 2014, and they were going to use Roundup as the default chemical that would be the baseline, and then comparing other toxic chemicals that are regulated herbicides against Roundup. And they were surprised to find that Roundup was actually the most toxic of all the chemicals they tested. So they have a quote from this paper: "It is commonly believed that Roundup is among the safest pesticides, but despite its reputation, Roundup was by far the most toxic among the herbicides and insecticides that we tested. And this inconsistency between scientific fact and industrial claim may be attributed to huge economic interests, which have been found to falsify health risks and delay health policy decisions." So here are some of the toxic effects of glyphosate. I started studying glyphosate in 2012, and this paper was published in 2013. I collaborated with Anthony Samsel, who is an expert chemist, toxicologist, and he's working passionately trying to, doing experiments on glyphosate as we speak. We published several papers together. This was our first one. And we summarized our findings from the research literature as far as the various ways that we would expect glyphosate to have an effect on human health. And the key one is the beneficial gut bacteria. It's been shown that the glyphosate disrupts the gut bacteria, preferentially killing the beneficial ones, allowing the pathogens to overgrow. And that causes things like inflammatory bowel disease and leaky gut. It also interferes with critical enzymes in the liver that play many important roles. These are called the CYP enzymes. They make the bile acids, they activate vitamin D, they detoxify many toxic chemicals and break down prescription drugs. And so when they're not working, all those things become problematic. And in fact, other chemicals become synergistically more toxic because of the common presence of the concomitant presence of glyphosate. It also binds tightly to a set number of minerals that are very important as catalysts for our enzymes, like cobalt and manganese and zinc, which makes them unavailable to the cells. And it interferes with the synthesis of these aromatic amino acids that I mentioned earlier, and also methionine, which is the key sulfur-containing amino acid. And that has many consequences. And possibly as a consequence of the disruption of methionine, glutathione becomes deficient. It's one of the reasons. Glutathione becomes deficient in the liver, and that is a very important antioxidant that keeps the liver healthy. This is just a chart of glyphosate usage, the dramatic increase over time, which followed the increase in, which paralleled the increase in the glyphosate-resistant weeds. And so these are the resistant weeds building up very quickly over here since about 2001. And that is probably an important reason why glyphosate usage continued to accelerate. Around here was when they introduced the GMO Roundup Ready crops. And so quickly, that of course is a major contributor as well. And this is in the United States. Now, so this was an interesting article published in 2017 on the web about cattle herds in Saskatchewan, Canada. And they'd been exposed to high levels of glyphosate in their feed, and they were getting sick. And so this is just 2 herds that were talked about in the paper. And this Clostridia overgrowth, I think, is a characteristic feature of glyphosate exposure in the gut. This is a pathogen or pathogenic Clostridia microbes overgrowing. They also had a large number of stillborns and weak calves with skeletal problems. They had fatty liver disease, mottled and friable livers, so the livers were really in bad shape. And they measured 448 parts per billion in the corn field, which is quite high. And then they had another herd that was suffering from a coccidia infection. And they also had a feed that was tested with high levels of glyphosate contamination. And they found that when they replaced the feed with healthy feed, and supplemented with iron and B vitamins, they were able to help to fix these problems. And this is a pig farmer in Europe, Eve Peterson. He has huge numbers of pigs. And they found several pigs that were born deformed. They basically couldn't survive. And so they took their tissues and tested them for glyphosate levels and found glyphosate in the lungs, the liver, the kidney, the brain, the gut wall, and the heart. So clearly glyphosate is accumulating in the tissues, and I think that's extremely disturbing. And he quoted, a quote from him is, the summary of my findings is without a doubt that Roundup sprayed on crops is the direct reason for the increase in fertility problems, abortions, deformities in animals. And as a farmer, knowing how nature works, I quite expect that people are already affected. So, so this is a great paper, very recent, 2020, not yet in fact officially published. It's an EPUB ahead of print in Chemosphere. And this is a review paper and has a large number of references of various evidence that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor. Now, endocrine disruptors are very important chemicals that cause tremendous problems with hormones. They really mess up the whole hormonal system. You can see there are all these glands in the body, the prostate, the adrenal glands, the thymus, parathyroid, thyroid, pituitary, all of these glands, and the ovaries that can be disrupted because of hormonal disturbances by these endocrine disruptors, which have a characteristic feature of being far more toxic at extremely low levels than they are at higher levels of concentration. So when you don't study those lowest levels, you don't see this endocrine disruptor effect. But they talked about many different papers, including cancer cells proliferating at parts per trillion. It increased the expression of estrogen and progesterone receptors. It disrupted the axis of hypothalamus, pituitary thyroid axis, altered the circulating levels of hormones like progesterone and estrogen, induced hypothyroidism, and that's been linked to autism in the offspring, altered the reproductive developmental parameters in animal models, induced malformation in zebrafish embryos. So many examples of papers that were demonstrating that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor. Now, this is a paper that was published by myself along with Judy Hoy and Nancy Swanson. The three of us collaborated together for quite some time. Judy's a fascinating person. She lives in the Bitterroot Valley in Western Montana, and she's been a wildlife rehabilitator for many years. And so Nancy Swanson is someone who had discovered all these correlations, very strong correlations between glyphosate usage on core crops and the rise in a large number of diseases in the United States, like obesity and diabetes and cancer, and so and autism. So Judy, so we got together, Nancy and I got together with Judy, and Nancy and I were sort of crunching data from the US, available data from online material from the US on health statistics over time in the United States to plot against glyphosate usage. And Judy had been looking at all these animals, and she had noticed that there were dwindling numbers of all kinds of different wildlife that used to be there quite commonly around her environment and were disappearing. She really was an expert on deer, and she had done a lot of tracking of the deer and their facial features and understanding that there was something going on that was poisoning them. Now, they have other things besides glyphosate. Certainly chlorpyrifos is another one that she worries about, but there is agriculture in the valley that she believes is harming these animals. And so she had, Judy had a lot of photos of various animals that had been killed maybe by a car accident or something. And she could look at their organs. And so she has these photos that we showed in our paper together of all these thymuses of these white-tailed deer that were in various degrees of tissue damage that was very clear from just looking at them. And so we had a number of different figures in our paper of this sort, both showing the images of the damage, of the organ damage in various animals, as well as looking at the statistics. This was part of the paper as well, the correlations between human diseases and glyphosate. So we were looking at infant data in particular, comparing US government data on glyphosate usage over time, over this time period when we had the data for the rise in glyphosate usage, and looking at the comparison with the rise in the prevalence of these diseases. And we found striking correlations for a number of different issues in the children: head and face anomalies, blood disorders, skin disorders, metabolic disorders, problems with the genital tract and the urinary tract, heart conditions, and lung problems. All of these things were very, very highly correlated. These numbers are all greater than 0.9, 1.0 is the highest correlation you can get. That's when the two curves coincide. So these curves are all very, very similar to the curve that shows the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. And of course, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but when you see this kind of correlation, you'd be foolish not to look for a causative reason for why glyphosate might be causing these problems. And then, this is one of the plots from that paper. And here we're showing the children. Congenital heart conditions is the blue line. The green line is enlarged right ventricle in the adults, human adults, and both of them are pretty strongly correlated with each other in rise over time. This is 1997 on the left, 2010 on the right. And the red boxes are the glyphosate usage on corn, wheat, and soy crops in the United States. And these three curves all have very strong correlations with each other. And so this suggests that glyphosate could be a causative agent in these diseases. And in fact, it's been shown that glyphosate does cause cardiovascular diseases. And this paper was a review of the literature showing potent effects of glyphosate on the cardiovascular system from previous studies. This is again a summary of the previous literature on that topic. Now, I think it's pretty clear that glyphosate is connected to our epidemic in fatty liver disease today. We have a worldwide epidemic. Certainly the United States is being hit very hard by the increasing rates of fatty liver disease, even among children. So there's a study that was published fairly recently. This is Robin Minaj et al., 2017. And this was a good study because they exposed the rats to levels of Roundup that were below the regulatory limits, ultra low dose of Roundup herbicide. And then they looked at their livers and found evidence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease in the rats following this chronic exposure to this very low dose Roundup. And another study here is from 2020, so a very recent study by Mills et al., showing that people who had fatty liver disease had statistically significantly more glyphosate in their urine than people who didn't have fatty liver disease. And among those who had the disease, the ones who had worse disease, a later stage, had more glyphosate statistically significantly than the ones who were in earlier stage. So there's a three-way split there that's correlated with the increase in the glyphosate levels in the urine. Again, it's just, it doesn't prove it, but it's very highly suggestive that the glyphosate is playing a role in the fatty liver disease. This is a brand new paper, 2020, on water fleas. And this is a nice study because water fleas are near the bottom of the aquatic food chain. So they are important for feeding many of the animals that live in the water. Fish, small fish and tadpoles and salamanders and all of these animals depend on the water fleas for their diet. When the water fleas are exposed to concentrations that are well below the approved regulatory threshold, they suffered from all these problems: developmental failure, systemic inflammation, degradation of the collagen matrix in their tissues, impaired wound healing, and disrupted gut microbiome. And so, so these fleas are being, of course, eaten by animals that are going to get contaminated with glyphosate that's in the water fleas, and that's going to take it up the food chain. This is an absolutely fascinating paper, and actually there's 3 papers. I've referenced 2 here. I'm absolutely stunned by the results of these very recent papers, 2019, 2020, showing again low dose glyphosate, so below the level, no observable adverse effect level. It's at half of that level exposure to pregnant rats over the course of the pregnancy and during gestation, the first while the pups are nursing. This was actually, I'm sorry, this is, from day 8 to day 14 of gestation. That's in the embryo, sorry, it's not during nursing. This one is only in that critical period of the development when the germ cell epigenetics is getting programmed. That's very important because it's the epigenetic programming of the germ cells that's causing the effects that are seen much, much later. So this was a low dose. The rats didn't seem to suffer from it. The offspring were okay too. They really didn't have much evidence of harm. But when you started looking at the later generations, the grandpups and the great grandpups, you started to see a lot of problems. So down here, the F3 generation suffered from many diseases, including mammary tumors, delayed puberty, premature birth abnormalities, prostate disease, kidney disease, and obesity. All of these effects were showing up in future generations who had not been exposed themselves and nor had their parents, but it went back to the grandparents and the great-grandparents generation where the exposure took place. So this is what epigenetics is about, that it disturbs the germline of the fetus And that gets propagated down into future generations, the effects. And this is a developmental exposure to glyphosate-based herbicide and depressive-like behavior in adult offspring, implication of glutamate excitotoxicity and oxidative stress. That's a big, fat, long title, and it covers a really good summary of what this paper is about. Quite interesting. In fact, there have been other papers that have shown this excitotoxicity of glutamate. When the animals are exposed to glyphosate, it causes inflammation in the brain that's due to too much glutamate in the extracellular space. And so the glutamate is causing the neurons to fire too hard, and it's causing them to have damage as a consequence of overfiring. And so again, this was a situation where the mother rats were exposed while they were pregnant. And then during the gestate, when they were nursing, 15 days following birth, so while the pups were nursing, the pups were never directly exposed. And then they looked at the glutamate excitotoxicity of the pups in their brains. And they found that even 60 days after when they were 60 days old, so this was long after that glyphosate exposure, they still had evidence of this neuroexcitotoxicity in the brain. And they showed signs of depression. They have these forced swimming tests where they can test for the animal not even trying to rescue itself. And that's an indication. They use that as an indicator for depression in animals. And so this suggests that, that depression could be related to glyphosate through the effects on glutamate, messing up the glutamate system in the brain. And then this is a paper that showed that low levels of glyphosate damaged neurons in mice in vitro. An in vitro study of the neurons from the mouse brain grown with exposure to glyphosate at permissible concentrations that are allowed in drinking water, probably in the United States. So they said our findings demonstrate that the permissible concentrations of glyphosate in drinking water recognized by environmental protection authorities are capable of inducing neurotoxicity in the developing nervous system. So that's very disturbing. And then our findings signify the need to review the safety standards established by environmental protection agencies concerning safe glyphosate concentrations in drinking water. And definitely, I think the United States standard is way too high. So in summary,
Oh, you're on your summary. That's okay.
is that good? I'm running out of time.
You are.
Glyphosate is the most used herbicide on the planet due to, in part, to its falsely perceived non-toxicity. Many diseases and conditions are rising in prevalence in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. In some cases, a direct link has been found in both humans and animal studies. And much evidence has accumulated that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor causing developmental issues, hormone imbalances, and cancer. And many recent papers have appeared showing glyphosate's toxic effects at exposure levels that are below regulatory limits, and also transgenerational effects. So we need to set a global goal, I think, of reducing the need for glyphosate in agriculture and in the forest industry. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seneff. Thank you. So what we're going to do is, while our presenters have a chance to have a quick look at the Q&A, because we have 9 different questions coming up there, we are going to launch one more poll. It'll be our last poll. And Rodrigo, if you can bring that up. So the poll is, what is your confidence level in government and manufacturer assurances that glyphosate is safe if applied according to instructions and permits? 1 is very confident that that's safe, and 5 is not confident at all in their reassurances. So we'll give everyone 30 seconds to respond to that. And I will get Dr. Sears to turn her camera on and her mic as well, please.
Back.
Okay, what do we have, Rodrigo? Oh, okay. 2% are confident with government and manufacturers' assurances. 75% are not. 4% not overly confident. 3 can be convinced either way, I'm guessing. 2, yeah, okay. So there is some confidence there. So 9% of our audience thinks that there may be some assurances that they can believe, but 75% of you are skeptical. Okay, we're going to move to the question and answer now. So we'll bring up Stephanie Seneff and Meg Sears to answer your questions. The first one being from an anonymous attendee. I understand, and I think Dr. Seneff, you addressed this.
Yes.
The so-called non-active ingredients of Roundup are just as toxic as glyphosate. Can you say something about that?
Do I click on the answer live?
No, you just answered live.
Okay, good. Yes, I mean, I was fascinated to find that out. I was really disturbed that they hadn't bothered to test. It's obvious that you should test the Roundup, the actual product that you're going to be using, rather than the isolated chemical that you put into it. Doesn't make any sense. And they never did. They got by with just testing the glyphosate. And these things are added to make it more toxic to the weeds, to make it more effective. So you can be pretty assured it's more toxic if it's more toxic to the weeds. And these things are both they cause the glyphosate to be retained and taken up by the plants, and they probably do the same thing in our gut. And they also are intrinsically toxic in and of themselves. And in fact, Seralini's team really revealed that, and they even became convinced that the additional ingredients were significantly more toxic. Even they said as much as 1,000 times as toxic acutely as glyphosate. What I believe is that glyphosate is the thing that sticks around and gets into your tissues, and that it is a cumulative insidious toxicity that glyphosate keeps going with after the rest of the ingredients have disappeared. So there's my opinion is that they are much more acutely toxic than glyphosate. Glyphosate has a subtle effect, but it's insidious, and that makes it very, very dangerous because it's harder to show the connections between the glyphosate and the disease you're experiencing because of that slow kill kind of approach that it has. And I talk about this, by the way, my theory for what's going on with glyphosate in the book that is coming out in June. I will explain how exactly the mechanism by which I think glyphosate causes its insidious slow toxicity.
Okay, thank you very much. Now there's a follow-up to that, which I think you've answered, but the person says, I think this should be part of creating awareness about the danger, toxicity of Roundup, those other non-active ingredients that can be even more of an issue.
Yeah, that's right.
That education, yeah.
I think so. I mean, to be aware that glyphosate is more than, that Roundup is more than glyphosate, and that, and I think there's another question that asks about Roundup versus the chemicals. There are many formulations of glyphosate, and the ones that are used on the farms are a much higher concentration of glyphosate than the ones that are used in residential use. So they're even more toxic than what you buy at your local store.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add that it's
Go ahead, Dr.
problem.
One sec, go ahead.
I would just add that it's a common problem with all of the pesticides, because if you just spray one chemical, then it's basically going to sit on the outside. So more things are added to improve the way it spreads over the surface and to improve the penetration through the cuticle of the plant, which is, kind of an impervious layer on the outside of the leaf, but it does exactly the same thing on our skin. It does the same thing on all of our membranes and so on, so it can be absorbed. It does exactly the same thing on the outsides of the bacteria in our gut. So what's done to make a pesticide more effective in the field basically does exactly the same thing on everything that's not intended to be treated with the pesticide.
All right, thank you.
Good point.
Andrea Francis just wants to thank Rod. Thank you, Rod. And the next question is, oh, and by the way, they like your dog. Someone likes your dog.
Yeah, he wants to come in. Just
I think he wants to be part of the conversation.
he does. He's very sociable.
Paul Strom is asking, will the participants have access to these PowerPoint presentations at the end of this presentation?
I can post mine up on my website if there's no reason why you would object. I could put them up on my website at MIT. You could find them there. I will do that.
Did they just search your name in MIT?
Yes, I think if you just search my name, you should find my MIT webpage. Or you can look at stephanieseneff.net and there's a link to it there. That's a simpler thing to remember.
Okay.
which is not my MIT webpage, but it has a link to it. If you ask for more information, you'll get to my webpage from there.
Okay.
And I will, and I don't have them up there yet, but I can do that right after we finish. So,
Okay, thank you. And Meg Sears, what do you?
Certainly we can put it on the Prevent Cancer Now website, and I can give you a file that you can share as you see fit.
Okay. Next question is from Susan O'Donnell. Of course, in Canada, we want to believe that our federal Health Canada's scientists are not influenced by political pressure. How do approvals and licenses for herbicides work in the US? And is the process free from political influence? I think that's a two-part question there. And I think Meg Sears might want to answer the first part about Health Canada. Or do you, Meg Sears?
All we can do is look from the outside. I will tell you that there are some wonderful people who do work at Health Canada, who, you know, they're working very hard to try to protect us from various things, but they are also working within a not very functional framework. So if you have this set of rules that you must adhere to, then they get kind of hooped. And that's part of the problem. And that's one of the things that we're really working with, is to say, okay, we've got to have better ways of assessing the science, of pulling all the science together. And we have to have better ways to be making our decisions, because the federal regulators, it's very prescribed exactly what they have to do and so on. Now, we feel that they are kind of circumscribing themselves excessively, and we find that the peer-reviewed literature is not included. And what happens is that instead of pulling together all the information, like was in those ATSDR diagrams that I showed you, they basically take the pile of research and say, well, this paper doesn't completely answer the question, and so we're going to put it aside, it's in the trash. And they just go individually through all of these research papers and say, this one is not complete in and of itself, and so it's discarded, rather than taking this comprehensive approach.
I see. Okay, now I'm going to go to Stephanie Seneff, and maybe you're more willing to go into the political influence question now in your country.
well, I think there's tremendous influence by the industry, and our government is not protecting us from these toxic chemicals. I think it's a shame that the industry is able to basically buy, I think there's a lot of industry funding that's just preventing them from thinking in favor of the population. I find it very, very discouraging that the government doesn't seem to be adequately concerned about the health of the people in the country. And we see so much evidence of bad health in this country. I mean, it's just shocking how much we spend for medical expenses. We spend way more than any other country in the world on the medical needs. And we have so many autoimmune diseases and high rates of autism and Alzheimer's, all these problems that are going up, cancer. And the government doesn't even seem to be concerned about it, let alone thinking that they should restrict herbicides.
For a betting woman, would you say that there's going to be some change?
I don't know. I don't have a lot of faith in the government right now. I got very discouraged when a whole team of us, 10 people on our own nickel, went down to Washington, D.C. and presented our findings on glyphosate to the EPA. And it was a very sad experience. I mean, they felt like they were doing everything they could to ignore what we were saying, and we got no response. And we just felt very frustrated. So I'm quite discouraged, actually, about the government. I'm so frustrated that I don't even really want to deal with them. I'm just like, we have to get it out to the general public, get people to eat certified organic food, get them to stop buying Roundup to use on their dandelions, and just really do this grassroots bottom up. If we can get enough people aware of the dangers, and if those people will spread the word among their friends and their family, eventually I think we can do this grassroots bottom up. I think that's the way it's going to happen. unfortunately.
Very much, and that leads into actually another question here. Is the Roundup that we can buy at hardware stores for home use the same as the agricultural forestry industry, or is it more diluted or less diluted active version?
It is less, it is more diluted. I don't know if you can agree with me, Meg, on that, but the Roundup that you buy for your yard is a weaker, it's the same chemical, glyphosate, but it's a weaker formulation than the one they use on the farms.
Well, on the farms, they dilute it themselves. In Ontario, actually, you're only allowed to use glyphosate on poison ivy and poisonous plants on lawns and gardens. Because that's the law. It took a very long time to get to that point. But in Canada anyway, all of the the home hardware kind of products, those are pre-diluted, whereas in agriculture, then the farmer does the dilution himself. So,
so he could dilute it to something lower, right?
Oh, he could, and quite often they'll mix things together. So now we have crops that are resistant to glyphosate and to dicamba. Recently, we commented a year ago, approximately, I can't remember exactly when, there's a type of corn that is resistant to 5, count them, 5 herbicides because of this problem with herbicide resistance. So we're just building, these super weeds and crops that can't grow unless, they're just dousing the landscape with toxic chemicals, and it's not giving us good food either. I do see one question here that I can answer. Keith Monroe asks, is there data on concentrations of glyphosate in the general population in Canada? And we have advocated for that to be measured for the last 15 years, and it is going to be included in the upcoming Canadian Health Measures Survey, which is a little bit like the national survey in the States, except it's not nearly as powerful. And we can expect those results sometime around 2025, perhaps. So, which, considering, we do have data on some other pesticides, but since glyphosate is by far and away the most used pesticide, I think it's very poor that our government has been basically unknowing about that. And I don't believe you've got a lot of data on glyphosate in Americans either. So this has been something that seems apparently to have just kind of slipped through the cracks in all of the national biomonitoring studies, which is most unfortunate. It's kind of this, they're just looking to keep people in the dark, and the scientists don't want to know.
Well, on that point, another question, how can we create more awareness around what you believe is happening?
This is a great start.
Yeah, people should host presentations like this and get people should prepare themselves to present a presentation.
Yeah, it's very difficult because it doesn't get a lot. It's very difficult to get some of these contentious issues in the mainstream media because there's a lot of very high-powered publicity firms that we're working against. So. But certainly, I think that people have to really support local agriculture, support your organic farmers, your sustainable agriculture, because not only is it important for to avoid glyphosate, it's important for stability, for the climate, for our food system. There are, great laundry list of really good reasons to be supporting local sustainable agriculture.
Okay. I'm going to leave Vicki Hogarth's question for Rod to answer because he was going to address that topic. Patricia Coxedge says there is a fairly new Canada Water Agency discussion paper open for comment. Will experts on this panel be using this opportunity to bring concerns and the need for much better standards forward? The Canada Water Agency discussion paper. Have either of you heard of that?
I
I've
haven't.
heard of it. Actually, lack of water, of concentrations of pesticides in water has been a stumbling block for the PMRA. They also, Quebec is actually very good at monitoring its water. They have more data than quite a few other provinces. So we do have the I think that it's a very important thing, and pesticides as major contaminants in waterways, we've been working on for a while. They also have waterways and wetlands are really important as the base of the food chain for a lot of other animals, because everything we eat, either every animal that we eat either spent part of its life in a wetland or eats something that spent part of its life in a wetland. So waterways and lack of pollution in them are really integral for not only the ecosystem at large, but it's really important for us as well.
Okay. Is there something, I'm going to go to both of you for this. Is there something that people can do leaving this webinar tomorrow or a month from now that you think would help the situation?
New Brunswick was interested and looking for comment on glyphosate in forestry. So I believe that's still open. It's not been closed. So they can get in touch with your ministry about this issue in particular. They can tell their MPs what they believe, what they feel. You know, the politicians have to know, as well as the, I think the Canadian Water, the consultation there would be a very good thing for people to be putting in, that we need to have this information because it's no good for our regulators to be working in the dark.
Okay. I'm going to go on to what advice would you give to activists who are trying to organize against the use of glyphosate in forestry and ag, but forestry in particular?
I don't know about forestry, but we do have activists in the United States like Moms Across America, Zen Honeycutt. I don't know if people know about her. And she's been really trying to.
Can you say
Zen
that?
Honeycutt is her name, and she's the founder of Moms Across America, which is an organization that has been promoting healthy eating and really putting up a lot of material on glyphosate and why it's bad, and helping to get the community aware of the toxicity of glyphosate. So you could probably learn from her in terms of finding out what she's doing to help spread the word, and then do something similar with respect to the forest industry. You could set up, someone could set up a website and have an organization that is specifically focused on glyphosate in the forest industry that could be modeled after what she's doing, perhaps.
Okay. Any suggestions, Dr. Sears?
Just to fill people in a little bit about Moms Across America, they were doing things like collecting breast milk and measuring glyphosate in it. So anything that will give you more data is a very powerful way to be, making your point. So if there are particular types of cancers, if there's particular hotspots that are associated with this kind of thing, that's particular spraying, that's one way to be aware of what's happening in your neighborhood, in your province, and get that systematically put forward to your ministries and to your MPs, and also do comments, say, we want to know. Not only should that water data be going to the regulators, it should be made public. And we have, there's a lot of work being done right now on open government. So public data on, there's just Google Open Government Canada, and there is increasing quantities of data there. And the more people look at that and ask for it and want details on it, the more we will get.
Okay.
And
Gerald
by
Edmond.
the way, is people have organized at the city level or at the county level to try to get glyphosate banned in public places and things like that. That's been a successful enterprise in a number of cities across the country in the United States, where they've gotten glyphosate banned locally, for example, in the schoolyards or in the public parks, that sort of thing. If you like to play local politics, that's a game you could work on.
Mhm.
Gerald Redmond asks, are you aware of any mechanisms for people to detox from glyphosate if they have bioaccumulations other than eating organic?
I can say something about that. There was a nice study that I found on cows that were sick. They tested their urine, found they had glyphosate in their urine, and they treated them with an exotic treatment program, which was sauerkraut juice, bentonite clay, fulvic acid, and humic acid. Those are sort of complex organic molecules from the soil. And they found that the treatment improved their symptoms and also reduced the level of glyphosate in their urine. And I'm sure they had reasons why they thought those things would work. And sauerkraut juice is quite interesting to me because these fermented foods contain Acetobacter. And Acetobacter are one of the very few species that have been shown to be able to break glyphosate down. So it's possible that probiotics, eating sauerkraut or taking apple cider vinegar, could be a way to metabolize glyphosate. If you can populate your gut with microbes that can metabolize glyphosate, that seems like a huge win to me. So I actually eat a lot of sauerkraut and apple cider vinegar with the hope that that might be happening. It hasn't been studied explicitly, but it has been shown that members of Acetobacter can break down glyphosate. And there aren't many microbes that can break down glyphosate because it has a very difficult CP bond that's hard to break.
Well, there's a Tan Cook sauerkraut here in Nova Scotia that's supposed to be quite good.
There you go.
All right.
All right. Interesting. Now let me go to Vince Zelazny. Is glyphosate number one on the global list of widespread nasty anthropogenic chemicals, or are there other chemicals worse than glyphosate?
Oh. I wouldn't want to be starting to say what's worse than others. You know, we've got some things that are much more persistent than glyphosate, like perfluorinated chemicals. We've got, there are lots of other, this is not a race. There are a lot of other chemicals that we have a lot of concerns about. Flame retardants, some things are much more persistent than glyphosate.
Right.
You can't really call that one.
No, but what I would say is that glyphosate is probably the most pervasive pesticide on the planet. Use, it has the most use, and
It has the highest use.
Yeah, and it's considered to be non-toxic, which makes people use it carelessly. And we're not monitoring it, so we don't know how much is in our food. So those are all negatives on glyphosate. Glyphosate's supposed to be much less toxic than other herbicides even. I don't personally think that's true, but I think its mechanism of toxicity is subtle and they haven't figured it out yet. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
So it's much more toxic than it appears to be. And it's much more common and it's much more casually used because we think it's non-toxic. All of those are working against it. So the other ones, could be more toxic, but we know that, so we're careful with them.
Without wanting to mix metaphors, I think we're comparing apples and oranges sometimes when we're trying to decide which is the worst chemical.
Yeah.
There's, they have different effects and so on, but right. There are some that are a lot more persistent, but
that is true.
It's quasi-persistent if you keep applying it, right?
Well, glyphosate does accumulate, and that's another thing that we were told it doesn't. It's supposed to be that it breaks down very quickly. A couple of weeks, it's gone. They've shown experimentally that is not always true, and there has been evidence that it can survive for a year or even multiple years. So it depends on the circumstances as to how quickly it breaks down.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I think we're going to have to wrap up soon. It's 8:13, so I want to give the last word to Rod Cumberland. So I want to thank you both very much for answering so many questions and being very informative. And so thank you. Stephanie Seneff for joining us from Hawaii, and Meg Sears from Ontario, a lot colder there. We'll just keep you up there for a minute, and I'm just going to ask if Rod Cumberland would like to say a few words to wrap up this session and maybe deal with the one question that or one of the questions we weren't able to get to, which was on Quebec.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. As far as the question on Quebec, the surprising thing was Quebec actually made the decision way back in 2001, which is 20 years ago. This is the 20th anniversary, and we have got a ton more research done since then. But based on what they knew, even in 2001, they had a very public process in Quebec to talk. They wanted to know what the public thought. They got a hold of all the research they could get. And if you wanted, the best summary of what happened in Quebec is actually on the CBC award-winning video, The Disenchanted Forest. So if you go into YouTube and Google the Disenchanted Forest, or just type it in and search it, that'll come up. It's a CBC documentary. It's very well done. And at the end of it, you'll hear from the people that were actually interviewed from Quebec at the time, and they'll tell you that it wasn't just public pressure. They did a lot of homework, a lot of research, and they made a very conscious decision to ban it at that time. So for me personally, just a little bit of an update. Obviously, we continue towards trial because it is before the courts. I can't speak to the specifics about my case, but I can tell you that my position hasn't changed and my resolve has only increased. Mm. I've said from the get-go that the whole thing smells. When I spoke to the media a year and a half ago, I told them then that I was shocked I was terminated. I just returned from a conference in the States for professional development. And 3 days later, I went to a meeting where this happened. So I also said from the beginning that the reasons that the college provided for just cause were false and were ridiculous. So nothing's changed on that front. And again, like I say, I'm even more resolved than I was before. I think it's preposterous that the public can't speak out on this issue. And it's even more absurd that scientists, such as the ones that we have here speaking tonight, can't ask questions without fear of reprisals, specifically in New Brunswick. The independent research, which was shared tonight, and actually this is just a small sliver of the research that's available out there on glyphosate, and it grows and grows over time. The Health Canada review, from my perspective, I've read it from cover to cover, all 350 pages. And as a scientist, it's completely biased and it's very unscientific. And I've written lots on it. I don't mind speaking to that about the issues that I have with it. So my road to justice is going to be long. It's already been a year and a half, and I'm told it may take another year before we can get into the courts. But my purpose is clear, and I want people to know the purpose in this is to give New Brunswickers hope. There's a lot of people that have been fired or reprimanded over the years. There's a lot of people in government that can't speak out about the issue and what they see on Crown land for fear of losing their job or getting reposted, and it happens continually. These people call me and continually encourage me to keep on going, spill the beans, stand strong. I feel that I'm able to speak for people that don't have that opportunity. So for the hunters and the fishermen, the woods workers, the people that are in the woods all the time, the DNR biologists I've worked with for my career, the forest technicians, technologists out there that are in the woods and see this all the time, I'm doing this for them. Someone has to say enough is enough and stand up for what's right, for the freedom to speak and for the public involvement in management of our Crown land. Now, the problem is I can't do it alone. And this is actually an opportunity for people to lend a hand. I find myself in a really humbling situation, which is accepting help and specifically financial support from friends and colleagues, and in a lot of cases, people I've never even met. At times, it's very overwhelming to hear what's going on from the support group. I don't take that very lightly. I know what kind of a sacrifice it is. My wife and I raised 4 kids on a hobby farm. I milked a cow every morning for 12 years. We grew our own garden. I know what it's like to have a tough time making ends meet. And I really appreciate people that, take from, their hard-earned living and actually have donated to the cause. I can't thank you enough, but I do want to take this time to say thank you very much for the people that have and for those that are considering it. This is definitely a team effort. And if we win, it will be, and disclose the truth on this, it's going to be a team victory. So I want to thank a lot the support team for their tireless work for me. And again, I never twisted their arms. They've done this on their own accord, and I'm really grateful and thankful. I'd like to thank Catherine and company here tonight, Dr. Sears and Dr. Seneff. Thank you so much for presenting the science from your two pieces of the world, and all those that have helped out to make tonight's seminar possible. I want to thank all those that have taken an hour and a half out of or almost 2 hours, I guess, out of their night to sit and listen. I think hopefully this will just be the first in the series. I want to encourage you, keep digging, keep sharing, and keep speaking the truth. Those that want to have an impact in our province, if you go to the New Brunswick Legislature website, you can go to there's a standing committee on climate change and environmental issues, and they are looking for input to that committee on glyphosate. So if you want to make your opinions and perspectives known, you can go there and submit what you think on the issue. And again, I'd encourage you to do that, because it's a truth that has to get out, and the truth will set you free. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share.
Thanks, Rod. So again, as Rod said, if you are willing to donate to the fund to help Rod in his legal battle, there is an address you can send an email to, or any transfer if you want more information. And that is friendsofrodcumberland@gmail.com. friendsofrodcumberland@gmail.com. And again, thank you all for being with us this evening. And there will be a second webinar focused on wildlife and the impacts of glyphosate coming soon. Watch for the Friends of Rod Cumberland Facebook page. That's where the information will be posted. So there you are. And thank you again to our presenters. And that's it. So good night. We'll stop sharing that slide as soon as you got that down. I get a chance to see everybody, and to once again say thank you to everyone, and hope to see you at the next webinar. Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Be in touch.